Hi, I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm Deputy Director for the Kansas City Public Library. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that you can get a weekly email from the library to keep up to date on all the great programming we have here at the library, both here at our location or else downtown at our central library. We can also mail you a monthly calendar that you get and stay in touch with all of our programs, but also other programs and services that are happening at our library so you can stay up to date. This is the one for April, and you can pick it up on your way out and get signed up for that as well. And inside, you'll find some of our great series coming up. One is called Making a Great City series, and a special presentation as well by the Kansas City Repertory Theater, a powerful production written by Tony Award nominee Christina Anderson, who is actually a native of Kansas City, Kansas. So look for that in upcoming programs. I also want to mention one more special event coming up on April 12th. And it's going to be right here at the Plaza Branch. We're hosting Buki Papillon, a winner of the second annual Maya Angelou Book Award. She's going to discuss her new book, An Ordinary Wonder. And the Maya Angelou Book Award is something we're really excited about here at the library. It's sponsored by the library as well as UMKC and 5 other universities in Missouri, and recognize literary merit, commitment to social justice, and how the book serves to enrich the diversity of American literature. So we're really proud to be a part of our own book award. We hope you can join us for that. So tonight, in addition to all of you here, I want to welcome those of you who are watching our live stream of this event. As always, we'll leave time at the end of this program for Q&A and ask that everyone who's here tonight to please come down to the microphone to ask your question. And then viewers at home can submit your questions anytime during the presentation via the YouTube chat, and then we will ask those questions as well at the end. Okay, now, I'm so thrilled to introduce my friend and longtime community partner, Gwen Grant. Gwen is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Greater Kansas City, and many of you know her, and in addition to her long Urban League leadership, Gwen is active both locally and nationally in numerous other organizations and initiatives, and is renowned as a strong, passionate advocate for social justice and economic empowerment for African Americans and for women in general. She and her team published the biannual State of Black Kansas City report, which will again be released later this year around October. Joining Gwen tonight is Shawn Rochester, the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Minority Equity Opportunities Acquisition, Inc. It's a special purpose acquisition company based in Washington, D.C. that is dedicated to the growth and sustainability of minority-owned and operated companies. Shawn has Fortune 100 C-suite executives and championed an inclusive economic framework to county executives, legislators, and even the United Nations. He'll sit down with Gwen to discuss his book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And earlier today, Shawn received the Urban League of Kansas City's Difference Maker Award from Gwen Grant. So right now, I'd like you to watch a short video with more about Shawn and his work.
Often when people are talking about discrimination, we're talking about the morality of it, we're talking about the injustice associated with it, and I wanted to take a different look at it. I wanted to look at what is the financial cost.
Pre-COVID, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. Pre-COVID, we're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees, right? People left bondage with no economic resources. There was this conversation about 40 acres and a mule, which we're all familiar with, right? And we all know never happened. You know, a lot of times people don't go a step further and say, you know, how much would that have been worth in today's dollars?
$250 years of slavery followed by another 75 years of extracting every nickel from you. Very often what you see today are miracles walking around. It's amazing that you have this level of achievement despite that. And I haven't finished telling you all the other stuff.
Please join me in a warm welcome of Gwen Grant and Shawn Rochester.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
So we're going to jump right in because Shawn has a lot to say, and my job here is just to kind of tee him up so he can just say everything that you need to know about the black tax. So just to jump right in and get started, the first question is, what is the black tax, Shawn?
Sure. So the black tax is the financial cost of anti-black discrimination that's driven by conscious or unconscious bias from individuals, organizations, or corporations.
You always give that really short answer, right? Because you could say a little bit more about that. But so a few days ago, I was driving and heard listening to a story on NPR. I really love KCUR, so support public radio. I get a lot of great information there. And I was listening to a talk about reparations in America, and a political science professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst has polled Americans to get a handle on or get information about their attitudes towards reparations. And what he found was that 2/3 of Americans say that they're against cash payments to the descendants of slaves, and that two of the most common reasons, one is that a plurality of Americans don't believe that descendants of slaves deserve reparations, which I thought was really quite interesting. I hadn't heard that perspective of we don't deserve it. And then the other is that they believe it is impossible to place a monetary value on the impact of slavery, and African Americans are really treated equally in society now. You know, we're post-slavery and we have equal opportunity. So what is your reaction when you hear these proclamations that we are not worthy or deserving of reparations and that all things are equal?
Yeah, it's, excuse me, it's not surprising because people are generally speaking from a position of passion that's complemented with a lot of not knowing the history and the context behind it. So are there things from the period of slavery that you could not value? Yes, there are some things from that period that you couldn't value. Can you value what it is to be a man who's unable to protect his wife or children over the entirety of their life? Very difficult to put a value on that. Can you value putting a value or a price on a woman who's unable to control her body over the entirety of her life, and knowing that that will be the case for her children and so on and so forth? No, it's very difficult to put a value on things like that. But you can put a value on labor extracted from millions of people for almost over a 250-year period. And economists have worked on that, right? Some place that value as high as 24 trillion, other people place it as high as 97 trillion with a T. If you assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that's as high as $50 trillion, right? Labor extracted from those people in today's equivalent. But you can also put a value on the people themselves, right? Because the people were capital. If you go back to 1860, you got about 4 million people, right, held in bondage. Those people are traded on open markets, right? There's a price if you're old or young, or if you're able-bodied or lame, man or woman. They actually represent the most liquid asset in the country. They're 50% of the full economic value of the South. They're 16 to 20% of the total value of the country. There's an enormous price on the individuals themselves, which economists have looked at. And that value on those people is so large that you have to measure it in terms of either national income or national wealth, right? So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, it's between 16 and 20% of U.S. wealth, right, at the time. At the time I wrote the book, U.S. wealth was about 85 trillion. It's 100 trillion now, right, but we'll stay with 85. So you're talking about 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of those two, you're at 15.5. You can also look at it from an income perspective, GDP. And it's estimated to be 1 to 2 years of GDP, the value of those people in today's equivalent. GDP is 19 trillion. So you're talking 19 to 38 trillion. Take an average of those, you're at 28.5. Those are two different modalities, a way of valuing those people. If you take an average amongst those two, you're at 22 trillion. Now you can go back to 1839, where Henry Clay is arguing what the value of enslaved people is on the floor of the US Senate, and he places it at $1.2 billion at that time. Then if you look at the work of Thomas Piketty, right, he says slave and slave-related returns generated 6 to 8% per annum associated with that. So if we used an after-tax number or even a smaller number, 5% over that period of time, that $1.2 billion then is closer to $24 trillion now. Now, if Henry Clay doesn't qualify because we don't know who he is, you can go back even further into the 1810s, so we can look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are saying, right? These are founding fathers about the economic value of people held in bondage at that time. And they placed the value at roughly 1 year of GDP or the sale of 1/3 of all public lands, right? 1 year GDP is 19 trillion. So no matter how you look at it, we're talking about really large numbers. And the idea around, people normally think of slavery and they say, well, it was a long time ago. It wasn't that big of a deal. When you say it's not that big of a deal, quantitatively what you mean is it was a small number. And we can see from the data that these are not small numbers, right, at all.
Break that number down. I asked you earlier today, because, I've been out of school a long time, and just how much is a trillion?
Yeah, so
when we hear that number, we know it's a big number, but...
So a trillion is 1,000 billion, and a billion is 1,000 million. So a trillion is a million. So it's a non-trivial amount is how we would characterize it.
So you have done a lot of analysis, and as you just shared, and so you've talked about the cost of slavery and the economic value of the black people who were in bondage in America. But what about the post-slavery? So we hear when folks are anti-reparations, slavery's gone, get over it, as you just stated. But a lot of folks just tend to stay in that space, looking back to slavery. But there's this continuation of harm, there's this continuation of discriminatory policies and practices that have excluded blacks from full participation in the economic mainstream of this country. So one of the big things we hear often is, we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule. Mm-hmm. There's that, broken promise. And how does that broken promise, what was the value of the 40 acres and a mule? Because I think it's really important to put that, to explain that, so that you can then better understand why the racial wealth gap is so wide and almost impossible to close.
Yeah, so 40 acres and a mule goes back to special order, field order 15, I think, by Abraham Lincoln. And the general concept was you're providing people with land, right, and mule to augment capabilities. So if 40 acres and a mule have been applied or provided to every person who was held in bondage, that'll be 160 million acres, right? So it's a massive amount. I shared earlier, right, that, I once looked at buying 400 acres with a group of friends, and for 400 acres, you got to go up in a helicopter, right? So 160 million is kind of hard to conceive. Now, let's put the mule aside for a moment, right? And let's just kind of focus on the 40 acres. If you look at government statistics on the price of an acre, it can range from $3,020 average to as high as $6,350. These are older numbers, so these numbers are higher now, right? So on the high end, when you do the math on that, that's about $1 trillion, right? And the thing you need to understand is, this is farm acres I'm talking about. I'm not talking about New York City acres or Bay Area acres or Miami Beach or Austin or wherever you have kind of ultra pricey real estate. It's purely kind of farm acres. So $1 trillion sounds like a lot, right? But it's only about 2% of the $50 trillion that was extracted from these folks over almost a quarter of a millennia. So not even 2% in terms of startup capital was provided. Now, let's jump back to the mule, right? So the mule is just augmented labor, right? It allows you to multiply your labor on the land. And you can think of that as the equivalent of having like a tractor, right, in today's kind of context. And a tractor is roughly $50,000 on average, across 4 million people, that's $200 billion, right? So the mule has value also. So you put those two together, you're at like 1.2 trillion. That was never distributed. And we have to remember that we're obviously in a capitalist society, and the worst position you can be in a capitalist society is to not have any capital, right? And if you go back to 1870, black people collectively own about 0.17% of US capital. Not zero, but effectively zero.
Oh, so you're done, okay. So,
I can go on if
I
you
know
want.
you can. So let me just, so this afternoon when we talked, we were really talking about the black tax and how it makes a compelling case for reparations, because the way with your work and your analysis, it truly helps us to get our arms around this, because it's really something that is highly controversial in many spaces. So, you know, when you've talked about the 40 acres and a mule, and that's slavery, post-slavery, but then the harms continue even beyond that. So if we talk about the Jim Crow era, which spanned almost another 100 years, can you share what was the economic cost of Jim Crow? And those of you who purchased a book, and this maybe will motivate others to do the same, those of you who purchased a book, if you turn to page 82, you'll be able to see a listing of these various costs. But I'm asking Shawn to just kind of elaborate for us, will you, on the economic cost of the Jim Crow era.
And actually, let me say one more quick thing about the 40 acres and a mule, right? Because you could say, all right, well, they didn't distribute land to people, fine, you know, who gets land given to them? But at the same time, you have the Homestead Act, 1862, they passed an act called the Homestead Act, and over the course of the next 60 years, you know, the government gives out 246 million acres to about 1.5 million white families. So if you do quick math on that, it's about 1.6 trillion on the high end, or roughly $1 million a family, right? So on the one hand, you have $1 trillion that's not distributed to people from whom so much was already taken in the first place. Then on the other hand, you have 1.6 trillion that's distributed, right, to other folks. So it could have been done, it was done, it was just not done for black people. You don't have an economic start coming out of that. Now, when we get into Jim Crow, the interesting thing about Jim Crow is it's such a non-descriptive name. Like, what exactly is Jim Crow? And Jim Crow is effectively a system of you know, laws and customs that's reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence, right? To reimpose 100% tax on the sharecropper. Now, I want to double back to an important point that I should have made at the onset of this conversation that I did not make, but I'll make it now, which is it's very important for us to understand that slavery by definition is 100% tax on your labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours, right? So not even you are yours. And the Jim Crow regime was meant to reimpose this tax. Now, it can sound hyperbolic. Yes, these were poor people, but surely they had something, right? And it wasn't 100%. But here's kind of the context. So you got those large, you know, mega plantations are broken into smaller lots. Newly freed people are encouraged to settle on those lots and to plant cash crops. And in exchange for cultivating those cash crops, they share in a portion of the crop, right? Literally where the name sharecropper, right, comes from. The challenge with that is that it's an actual contract and the terms and conditions are set by the white farmer. And some of those terms and conditions are quite draconian. Some of them state, like, if you fell ill, they could hire someone else to do your work and then charge you back for it, right? The other challenge is that people have no economic resources. and the crop doesn't come tomorrow. So between now and the end of the season, that white farmer has to provide you with food, shelter, clothes, tools, seed, every single thing that you need to cultivate that crop at interest rates as high as 70%, right? So effectively, they control your cost structure. Now, here's the other thing. At the end of the year or the season, when you take the crop to market, they are the market. They tell you what it's worth and what your portion of that is worth. So if a person controls your cost structure and they also control your revenue or your income, by definition, they control your profit. So I think you see where I'm going with 100% tax. Now, the further challenge is that if they're concerned that you might go to someone who's more generous, what they'll do is make your expenses higher than your revenue. So you will have negative profit or you will owe them. They'll roll that into the following year, and now you're in perpetual debt servitude. Now, here's the thing, and I know what you're thinking, and what you're thinking is that's a horrible deal. I would never sign up for that deal. And I feel you, but the problem is they have a law for that. And those are called vagrancy laws. And those laws state that if you cannot prove that you're a landowner, and if you cannot prove that you're gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense, put you in a state or county jail. So you're probably going to sign that contract. And if you change your mind after signing that contract, they have laws for that, right? Those are called contract enforcement laws, which means if you break that labor-based contract, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. And you can say, I'm going to sit in jail, I'm still not going to do the work, and you could feed me 3 square meals a day, but they have something for that, and it's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back out to the very same white farmer or private corporation that you never wanted to work for in the first place. And the important thing to understand about convict leasing is there's one aspect of it that you can argue is even worse than slavery, just one aspect, which is while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive. So, but they would much rather have you around for another 10, 15 years to maximize the return on their investment. There is no such interest in your residual value under convict leasing. They only care about maximum extraction of resource from you over the contract period, 6 months, 8 months, 18 months. That's it. They don't care about your health and well-being beyond that. And under that regime, you're looking at mortality rates that approach 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance of death, right? So I'm going to date myself here a little bit. But, you know, we all like to think of ourselves as MacGyver, right? You guys remember MacGyver? We could jump into the situation with some duct tape and a pocket knife. It'll be different if it was us. This was not that, right? This was nefarious by design, and it was elegant in its nefarity, and it was hermetically sealed. You were going to be under maximum extraction, right? And as you said, it lasted about, 75 years, roughly. And you got to remember that during that 75-year period, we've documented that 4,000 black people were lynched under that period, executed. That's the equivalent of 1 black person per week publicly executed by their fellow citizen for 75 years. Nobody's prosecuted for those things. And the point there is no one is coming to save you from that construct.
So I'm sure many of you know that a little while back, the City Council for Kansas City, Missouri, under the leadership of 3rd District Councilwoman Melissa Robinson, who introduced the ordinance, passed an ordinance to establish a commission on reparations for Kansas City. And as we talk about, there are about 10 cities across the country and the state of California who are currently engaging in efforts to address reparations in some way and to do the research to look at, study the problem, what is the best pathway to achieve reparations. So as we look at Kansas City and we think about what a reparations commission would look like here and what they would study, certainly I believe, in fact, the commission is supposed to research the impact of discrimination in wealth, health, education, home ownership, and criminal justice, and then advise the city council on how to address that. So when in your work, can you share what was the economic cost of educational discrimination, employment, labor market discrimination, and housing discrimination?
Yeah, so great question, very big question, right? I'll try to do it justice, but there won't be enough time to actually do that. But let's kind of talk a little bit about, education, which is, human capital development, which is critically important. What you're dealing with is, a planter class that was interested in massively cheap, abundant labor, right, for Black people, and not a sound education system that went into it. So, if you go back to 1914, there's a person who's president of the General Education Board. You can think of that as like the Department of Education before the Department of Education. He's responsible for all of it. And his view is that Black people needed to be educated in such a way that they would readily, adopt or take menial labor. And that would lead the more expert labor available to white Americans, right? So that's their modus kind of operandi. If you look at the work that Du Bois was doing in his analysis, post-emancipation, he says that the investments made in education for Black people by Black people rivals the amount that white people put into it. So this is the people who have less than 1% of economic resources, far less than it. So a massive investment in it. If you look in the South, during the early 1900s, you've got, 64 public high schools for Black people. This isn't in a region or a state. This is across, right, the southern states. If you look at, the investment that's being made, for every dollar you put into a Black child, they're investing $5 to $8 in a white child. There's no rocket science there. If we do that with our own children, one is going to be impoverished, the other is going to go to Harvard, right? If you look at, Black teachers, they're making 25 to 34 cents on the dollar for teaching the same subjects, massively, undercompensated, right, for the work that they're doing. If you look at what's happening in New York City in 1920 versus South Carolina, for example, under the segregated system, New York City is investing 50 times more per pupil than what South Carolina is doing in their segregated system. And what you have to remember is New York City at this time is not the diverse melting pot that we know. It's 97.1% white, right? So you think about people who are coming to the country and settling in that area, the massive amount of human capital development that's being poured into them. And now you have to apply this across millions of students, right? Over a generation. The researchers say that, if they had just invested in the children equally, you keep the other discrimination the same, that could have closed the wealth gap or the earnings gap between Black and white, people by up to 50%, just in investing in the children on an equal basis. When you look at the impact of that over a generation of millions of kids, that's over $600 billion. When you look at that from 1865 to roughly 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, right, that's topping $3 trillion in impact. And even if you look at education, post Brown v. Board of Education, right, at the time that Supreme Court came down with that decision, there were 82,000 Black teachers teaching just over 2 million Black students right across the country. Within a decade, 40,000 of that 82,000 Black teachers were fired, were eliminated, right? 90% of that decade of Black male administrators, principals, and others were also eliminated during that period of time. Right now, only 7% of educators are Black, and only 2% are Black males. So, and the implication of that is that today we're missing about 352,000 Black teachers, right? And the average teacher at the time of the work made about 49,000 and some change dollars. So when you add that up with salary and benefits, it's about $20 billion a year that's not going to Black teachers, that's not going to those communities that they're a part of. And that's every year. That's this year, that's last year. And by the way, that was going on for 60 years, right? So the impact is actually extraordinary. And it also provides important context, right? People are not abdicating their responsibility to educate children, they were systematically eliminated, right, as a result of that decision. And then the follow-on impact was, to be a teacher in a black community was a big deal, right? They represented 50% of the black middle class that was wiped out in a decade, 25%, off the table. So the impact on education is obviously, huge. When you start to talk about estimates on, the economic costs of discrimination in the labor market, right? There's research that says between 1929 and 1969, that's $1.6 trillion, but that's in 1983 dollars. So when you bring that forward to today, just bring it forward by inflation, it's over $4 trillion of economic impact, right? So, and then even if we stay in that time period, because I won't have to go into redlining and all that stuff, you guys know it very well. But if you get into what was the empirical impact of that? So if you go to 1929 to 1969, less than 1% of all mortgages, right, in the country went to black people. I'll repeat that. Between 1929 and 1969, less than 1% of all mortgages, right, went to black people. So you're talking about the most powerful asset that's existed ever, right, in the history of the world, and you're unable to participate in it because you're not getting the same kind of underwriting that others got. And that led black people to get mortgages through other private structures that were draconian, which we have time, we could talk about that. But, and the economic impact is significant. That's why it's like a $4 trillion delta in economic value in terms of real estate owned by black people. And then remember I talked about the public lands and all that? 1870, black people own less than 1% of all land in America. Still own less than 1% of all land in America, right? There needs to be, the idea that people are doing that to themselves over a multi-100-year period doesn't really seem to make sense. There's something else that's happening, right, in a broader context that's imposing that. You can't get these kind of outcomes on a consistent basis.
In that same newscast that I was listening to, there was someone who talked about how, things, we're a nation of immigrants, we're all immigrants. We, as, didn't our forebears didn't come, by choice, but we still are a nation of immigrants, but that now all things are equal, and if we just work harder and, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, everything will be great. When you, in your book, you talk about how the discrimination is so pervasive in every aspect of our lives that it's virtually impossible to close this wealth gap. You define the gap, because today when you talked about that, I think it's important to really magnify that or amplify that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. A lot of people are working really hard to do their best to close the wealth gap, right? And I think that's terrific. The issue becomes, what is the wealth gap, and how much is it, right? And the wealth gap is about $14 trillion. How do you get to $14 trillion? It's because the average mean difference in wealth between a typical white family and black family is $841,000 of difference in wealth. And if you take that across 17 million black families, you arrive at the $14 trillion. So the wealth gap is massive, right? You're not going to solve this next Tuesday with a 3-point plan. So that's very important that people understand that context. When I define the black tax, which is the cost of discrimination against black people, it's driven by conscious and unconscious bias. Driven by conscious and unconscious bias. So it begs the question, well, what are those levels, right? Like, do white people really have anti-black bias? Like, is that really the case? Does anybody kind of have it? So you got to look at the data, right? So if you go back to 2012, you got the Associated Press, places like, Michigan and Chicago and Stanford, do some analysis, and they want to see what's the level of anti-black bias that's in the electorate. And when they look at conscious bias, like people know exactly what they're doing, or anti-black attitudes, it's about 50%, which is very high, by the way. That's 1 in 2. And then when they looked at unconscious bias, people don't know what they're doing. They don't mean to be able to do it. It was like 56%, right? So almost kind of 6 in 10. If you look at the work that Harvard has done, they have an online implicit association test, which is just a really clever way to tease out and to measure the level of implicit or unconscious bias that people have, right? And it's for free. You could take it online and the like, and millions and millions and millions of people have taken that, right? And the levels are like 75+% of the people who take that have anti-black bias. Now, it's Harvard, so they call it automatic white preference, which is a wonderfully genteel way, right, of characterizing it. But it's anti-black, bias, right? So the levels are high and they exist. So the idea like, oh, it's not me and it's not our organization, the probability of that is quite low given the high prevalence of it. Then the issue becomes, how now does that bias show up? In my purview, from a commercial economic perspective, right? And I don't take a position on whether people, it's conscious or unconscious, I don't know, you don't know. But the economic effect when it lands is the same, regardless of the intention, right, associated with it in its origin. So those levels are high, and they show up, on a pervasive basis, particularly in areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation for black people. So, home ownership, financing, automotive, the insurance, online, job search, capital raising for businesses. Like it shows up in a continual way there.
So the time is going really, really fast. And we didn't get to talk today about something in your book that I'm going to ask you to share. You talk about the 2% rule. Mm-hmm. Can you what is the 2% rule?
Yeah, so when I was doing the research, this number 2% kept coming up again and again and again, right? And it really, what it appeared to be was that in areas that are critical for wealth accumulation, black people, we tend to participate at a 2% level. So if you ask the question, how much corporate supply chain spend is with black enterprise, it's less than 2%. If you say how much government supply chain spend is with black enterprise, not diverse enterprise, black enterprise, it's less than 2%. That's at all levels, federal, state, local, period, right, end of story. If you say how much is SBA lending for black businesses, 1.6%, again, it's less than 2%, right? So if you say, the number of black male doctors is 2%. So it kept showing up again and again and again in this kind of universal way where it seemed like our participation rate in really critical areas. So in high growth, high compensation fields, what's the concentration of black people that tend to be in there? It's like less than 2%, right? So I called it this 2% rule, right, or paradigm where you tend to see our participation rates.
So there was a couple of things I want to try to get in here in the next 5 minutes. One is, I'll end with that, I've got two. So the first is, do you believe that America as a whole would be stronger if blacks had been granted full and equal access and inclusion in the economic mainstream?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. The way I approach that is, so when we talk about like the post-slavery Jim Crow period, right? The other thing that we have to recall about that period is an extraordinarily productive portion of the Industrial Revolution, right? So during that period of time, about 2.5 million patents are created. Things that are foundational to our economy now, planes, trains, automobiles, transistors, like all that stuff is motion pictures, right, copiers, all that stuff is being commercialized and patented at that time. If you say of that 2.5 million, how much of that came from black people, it's 726. Almost a complete and total shutout of that innovation process, right? And a great question is, as you so elegantly stated, what would have happened if we had been allowed to participate? And one of the things that's important to know is that talent, skill, capability tends to follow a normal distribution or a Gaussian spread. super fancy way of just saying 70% of people tend to be in the middle, 15% tend to be substantially above. I call that group the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group. And 15% tend to be substantially below, right? So this is independent of race, ethnicity. It's just a human kind of characteristic of distribution. So the question is, if you look at that black ultra brilliant population over that time period, right, 1870-ish, right, into the 50s, what was the size of the population and what were those people doing? Because they're very, very capable folks, right? So if you start at 1870, about 730,000 people, not the black population, just this 15% of ultra brilliant. That number climbs to about 1.3, about 1900. It goes up to about 1.8 when you get into 1930 and about 2.3 by the time you get to 1950. What are those people doing, right? They're doing a combination of tenant farming and sharecropping and domestic work, a massive gargantuan underutilization of skill and capability, right, associated with those folks. What if those folks have been fully incorporated into that innovation system, right? What we would have been looking at is 230,000, more patents, which would have translated to about $2 trillion more in GDP, right? In addition to about $9.6 trillion of more of wealth. So when you look at the long tail view of what's happening with innovation over the last 150 years, it's a constant flow of innovation drives a constant flow of economic growth. This is empirical. This is in the data. This is well known and understood. So we lose, right, because of that. And if you look at the work of Gary Becker, he wrote this book called The Economics of Discrimination, terrific book, in the 50s based on research he had done, leading up to that point. And he won a Nobel Prize. He laid out that there's both the discriminator and discriminated pay an economic price for the discrimination that happens, right? That price is proportional to the capital between the two. And the other thing that he laid out very clearly, which is a well-known, accepted economic fact, is that when you have discrimination between two societies, it reduces trade and commerce between them proportionally. As you increase discrimination, it reduces trade, right, and commerce. And for those of us that have like a responsibility to drive capital, we call it, fiduciary responsibility, it's our duty to make sure that discrimination is minimized so we can have trade and economic activity maximized, right? Yes, there was a massive economic cost for black people. There's no question about that. There's also a massive cost for the country. That's on the order of $2 trillion. Even if you look at the work that was done by McKinsey, right, and company, they said if you eliminated the wealth gap, it would generate $1.5 trillion for the country by eliminating the wealth gap, right? By the way, they did this after the book was published.
Yes.
So they're a pretty good shop, so we can trust them.
So the other question I have, because we talk about all this and how do we mitigate for this? What can we do about the black tax?
Yeah, so that's where the real work kind of begins, right? So typically the opposition that people have to disenfranchisement of black people is because they're not aware of any disenfranchisement. We live in massively differently resourced communities, but the curriculum's the same, and this stuff is not in it. So for lots of folks, they're like, well, I don't know why we're talking about this. It was a long time ago. It wasn't that bad. Affirmative action's been happening for a while. You've been free riding. We should be all good. So having the context, having the information leads to the paradigm shift. It leads to understanding. The real work is how do you fix it, right? And the it is quite large. It's $14 trillion. So one of the things that we need to do is we have to think about this is an ecosystem effect, right? There's no point solution that's going to work by itself because there's no one thing that kind of caused this, right? So, and the scale at which we need to do things needs to increase dramatically. We are generally investing, $1,000 solutions into $1 million problems, $1 million solutions into $1 billion problems, and $1 billion solutions into $1 trillion problems. We're off by multiple orders of magnitude. So the first part is the scale. The second part is to get people to understand the need for it, right? And then the third part becomes what's the infrastructure that we're going to use to be able to solve these challenges, knowing that it's not zero sum, it's not like this person's loss is that person's gain, because it actually makes the pie bigger when you address these things. And then the specifics of what we need to do, we're going to need some more time,
More time.
for
Okay.
that.
Perfect. Got 15 minutes left. It's right where we're supposed to be to open it up for audience engagement, so that you may ask your questions of Shawn. And if you have a question, please come to the mic and don't shout it out from back there. Come down to the mic and
Yeah. I would like to bring up the situation of status anxiety, where people who are sort of in the chips in the past that feel like that they are in danger of sliding down the greasy pole. White farmers, small business people that in small towns perhaps, who maybe were privileged and maybe they still are, but they look out in the future and they think that their kids and grandkids won't have what they had, and are starting to slide down the greasy pole. If somebody feels that way, that they're going to lose what they have, does that increase or decrease prejudice? If you think you're up here, but you're going down here before too much longer, how does that affect in your opinion, how does that affect people's willingness to kind of back off and show some consideration? Just consider that.
So it's hard to be honest, it's hard for me to say, right? Because I'm not in that position, and I haven't looked at studies that have surveyed people who are in that position. So I could just give you my thoughts, right, on it. So I just want to qualify it with that. My view is kind of multi-part. The first is, if someone feels like they're sliding down, the real question is, are you really? Or you may not be, right? So the other piece is, white Americans own 90% of all economic resources in the country, so you're doing pretty well. You know what I mean? You're winning, if you need to be reminded. The issue is, and if you are sliding down, because that's 200 million people, but now we're talking about individuals, why, right? And the question becomes, the perpetrator of those slides are often pointed at, black people or Latino people or some other kind of group. And the issue is that the case, right? And has there been wealth transfer? Absolutely. There's been wealth transfer from the middle class into corporations in the top 1%, which is not black people and all these kind of other folks. And the order of magnitude of that is estimated to be around $2 trillion. So that could have affected people where they feel like they're kind of losing, but that's not as a result of what black people or kind of African American people are doing. The other piece of it is you also have to keep in mind that restoring people to a better economic position is a win for everybody, right? They went in, they did the Marshall Plan in Europe after it was wiped to the ground, right? In World War II, that was a win for Europe, that was a win for America, that was a win for the world, that was a win kind of for everybody, because it's best to not have your neighbor destitute, because we know bad things happen when that's the case. So that's kind of, I wish I could give like a better context, but that's my view.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And thank you for the work. I don't know how many hours or months or years that you've been doing the work, but I think having a conversation is important. And thank you for putting it into writing. And I appreciate everything that you've said, and I can't dispute mostly I can't dispute what you've shared. But there's one thing that I want to challenge. You said that, part of this, what do we do about it, is the unconscious bias, but it's really what we're going to do with it from there. Is that correct? I think you said it's more important with what will we do about the gap, correct?
I said that's the hard part.
That's the hard part,
Yeah.
okay. I guess I was just thinking too, the hard part is really the unconscious bias. If we can't see we can't see it, then those people, especially who are in a position to create a pathway forward, there's not necessarily any motive to do anything different. And it's just, I'm from a school that says you change your thoughts, you change your behavior, and you can change your life. And
Right.
that there's more, there's as much out there to say the philosophy about changing your thinking, and how do we move from what I don't know that I don't know into a field of knowing.
Right. So I'll offer you a couple thoughts on that.
Okay.
Most people are not path setters or path makers. They're path followers, right? And there are people amongst us that have a disproportionate ability to affect policy, policy creation, to execute policy, and even to allocate resources. It's in the hands of smaller groups of people, right? So if you want to affect change and you can touch some of those folks that have a disproportionate ability to affect those things, they can affect thousands and tens of thousands of people, right? So the idea isn't necessarily that we need to convince everyone, right, at this moment, but there are some people that have more ability to affect change than others, right? And we need to certainly affect those folks. They might have policy that affects the entire school district, right? And then it will happen over time that people see that the policy is working and that they may now come to accept it. So that's kind of how I think about that portion of it.
I was just thinking about the impact of being in an oppressive environment, dealing with racism on health. There's a book that just came out. I don't know the author. It was on NPR. You guys can look for it. It's called Weathering. And it basically indicates that when you are living your life in an oppressive environment, I don't care how much money you make, you know, you have that extra, as I tell my white friends, of which I have many, I swim in a different pool than you do. And they're indicating, and this is some Harvard research, that it actually affects you on a cellular level and the impact it has as far as life expectancy, that sort of thing. So when you fast forward and you're in economics, I know a little bit about that kind of stuff myself. I'm an MBA in finance and marketing. There is the huge cost in healthcare. So that's one impact. And it's just such a ecosystem. And I think one of the challenges in our society, which is, like you said, economically based, that we really don't have a very good view of how to analyze cost, because the cost is much higher to not provide the care, because as you said, the economic impact. So how do we, deal with that? Because, and I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but a lot of times when we're in that ecosystem, being in the oppressive environment, even if we're accustomed to it, a lot of times the oppressed are not given the strategies, they don't have access to the strategies in order to mitigate that. If you're having to work 2 jobs, 3 jobs to sustain your family, you're not meditating. You're not possibly exercising. So how do we really, because we cannot force the hand that may have to do the policy changes. What can we do that is within our control to, address it ourselves? I mean, I went to UNC Chapel Hills, white. I went to Clark Atlanta, black. But even with less resources, I think one of the things that I'm very proud of as a people, we have done much with little. So how do we keep that going and sort of shift the tide so that we can be healthy physically, psychologically, in order to be able to pursue?
Yeah, so that's a big question that spans a lot, that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice, right? So there is no question that there's a health cost to discrimination against black people. We die earlier than white people do, right? It took us to 1990 to get the life expectancy that white people had in 1950. There's no question. And the impact of us dying early is $200 billion a year of economic resources. So you could put a number on it. It's a real thing. And that's bad for us, that's bad for the whole country, kind of so on and so forth. The resolution of that is one of these things that has to happen, over time, right? So the first is, from a policy perspective, it's very important that we vote for people who have plans and programs in place to affect the kind of specific change that we want, right? Like, the vote is actually quite powerful if it's applied in the right way. You have total control over that. That's why people are working really hard to ensure that you don't maximize the impact of that. But then it's also, health outcomes are tied to wealth perspectives. So this kind of gets back to the same thing, right? So, as you start to close that wealth gap, you start to have better, health outcomes. But we're affected by it. I mean, they did a study in Florida, 1.8 million infants born. I think there's like a 3 times multiple on infant death if it's a white doctor versus a black doctor. I mean, that's empirical, right? It did it over many, many years. Like, it's a very real thing, right? Black people are perceived to have a higher pain tolerance, right? Especially black women. I mean, it's extremely deleterious. The problem is this bias shows up in ways that's bad for our health, it's bad for our wealth, and it's bad for our mental well-being. There's no question about that. Your question as to what to do about it is, this is an outcome of a wealth gap, right? And it's also an outcome of a highly discriminatory environment, but a person's ability to effectively discriminate against you is proportional to the capital difference between you and them. So as you have more resources, it's harder for people to, if they don't like it, it doesn't matter so much, right? But if you don't have a lot of resources, the big difference, then they can affect you a lot. You cannot be employed there, they can do some things. So addressing the wealth gap addresses this kind of over time. There's no immediate solution to that. I feel the stresses, I live it, I know, very well. But the way I think about this is the resolution of this is 50-year planning to address these issues. This is not the 3-point plan for next Tuesday, right? And we have to be committed to that over the long term.
I thought you were done. I want to thank you also for sharing this information. I love the numbers that you've put to this. I'm an accountant and I love numbers and I love the facts that come from it. The question I have is really more of a forward-looking. I've got nephews, this younger generation, they're buying properties, they're keeping their properties, they're getting good jobs, they're getting good, degrees. Are you seeing the potential reduction of this wealth gap as Gen Z comes along and some of these other generations or millennials are making forward progress? Are you seeing forward progress?
Depends on how you define progress. So people tend to define progress for black people relative to the 0 state. So if you don't have 0, you're doing great. So if you have 1% or stuff like that, I don't define progress in that way. I define it relative to where you should be from a proportional perspective, right? So you could, are we being lynched from trees? No, but we have 2% of wealth and we're missing $14 trillion, right? That's not a whole lot of progress. And that $14 trillion is increasing every year. So within the context of black people, there are gonna be people who do well, but the general population of black people is not doing well. For example, there's studies that say it would take us 228 years to accomplish the amount of wealth white people have today at the current rate of change.
If all things were equal.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not with white people standing still, they would still be, right? 35% of our families have 0 or less net worth, and in under 30 years at the current level, that's gonna be 50%. So what you can do is you can draw a circle around a very small group of people that are doing well. That's called survivorship bias. We find 2 or 3 kind of unique people and we say, oh, things are going great, but we don't look at the 1,000 that left with them. There's only 2 that showed up, right? So that's not how we should value things. And that's the challenge is we can't model outliers. By definition, it's not scalable, it's not modelable. We need to raise the average, and the average is not going up. Yeah.
Again, thank you for being here. You kind of stole some of my thunder, but so I'm going to change this on the fly. So I think that I can't wait to read your book, number one. When I think about the allies that are in the room, and I know that some people may not want to feel bad, but yet they're here.
Yeah.
And so what would you say to the allies that are here to help get them to spread the word? And then I guess also, is there anything in your future about making this national or getting on television with things like that? So talk to me about that.
Let me go into the feel bad part, right? Because we often hear this, like people feel guilty, they feel bad, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, you feel that way because you're a good person, right? If you were like murder, mayhem, telling me more, then that would not be awesome, right? You feel bad because it's worthy of feeling bad. If it was me, I would feel bad. Like, these things happened, right? They're not great things. So that's the first thing. It's like, you're not a bad person. You feel that way because you're a good person. The second thing is the vast majority of wealth is in the hands of white people in particular, non-black people in general, right? So your impact can be massive. Now, in the book, I talk about this thing called PhD, which is purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand, create wealth and expand wealth in the black community, and improve employment. So it's all about jobs, business, capital. So one of the important things we should do is we should commercialize black enterprise, right? We should put money in kind of black financing institutions and those that put capital right into our communities. I should do that, you should do that. We have massively different levels of capital, so your ability to affect change can be orders of magnitude bigger. You can, make sure, white people in general tend to have 7 times more business infrastructure in their wealth. So, buying from black enterprises, right? Making sure that you have, black people properly represented in your payroll at all meaningful levels, not hyper concentrated at low income. Like, these things can create tens of thousands of jobs, right? And it ripples through families, right? And it's a wonderful and amazing thing. When you have your retirement funds, right, where are you putting that capital, right? In the hands of private equity owners and whatnot, who can then invest in companies at scale and apply these things. Like, you can have tremendous effect, right, when it comes to that. So, live, do, PhD, you can do that now. Use black lawyers, use black doctors, use black professionals, buy cars from black dealers, increase the demand for these products and services because it stimulates hiring and make capital available, right, to us. My view on anybody who wants to be an ally or the person who's receiving the allyship is take the help, right? Take the help. If people kind of believe in what you believe in and they're genuine, take the help. Don't try to do it all yourself. We can do more than what we're doing, but we don't have the resources to do all that needs to be done. And for allies, if it doesn't show up in terms of jobs, business, and capital, then it's a shiny object, right? And it's unhelpful. It might make you feel great, but it should be measurable in terms of its impact. And then we can work on the underlying infrastructure to drive those things. So, quick answer for a big question.
My question is, all this is high end. We have infants that are coming up into this world that we live in, that we don't want them to be stagnated as we have been. How do you get the minds open enough to start teaching our children that they have the same rights, abilities, and wills that our allies have? That Jim Crow, where we put our sons back here so they don't get. institutionalized. And our daughters up here, where they're not the women that they're supposed to be, or the young ladies, because they have to be the head of household. Ow.
Yeah. That's very big, right? So, the first level of education starts with us and at home, right? So we have to be educated ourselves about what happened, and it's not in our curriculums, and it's not discussed in the media, and there's a critical mass of ignorance, unfortunately, that exists kind of in general. So we have to become more informed, and that's hard to do because it's a positive action that we have to take with everything else that's kind of going on. So we could teach our children more about ourselves. Because the discovery period you go through as a black person is if you're lucky, you start to discover that you actually did more and had more value and played a more important role than you ever knew and thought, kind of as you go through life. So we have to be able to teach that to our young people. The second thing is you have to put this into the curriculum, which is why people are fighting to make sure it's not in the curriculum. Because when it's in the curriculum, then you understand. You're like, oh, I get it. It's not that we are consistently and horribly inept over a multi-hundred-year periods. It's because you have structural and intentional impediments that have been put in a way, and it's actually worthy of study. It's worthy of redress, right? It's worthy of restitution or recompense. So it has to go into the curriculum across, for all of us. And then the other thing you're talking about is a change in culture, because this discriminatory, oppressive environment, feeding, changing, morphing the culture of who we needed to be able to survive in this environment, right? And that's a much bigger thing. Like, that starts with the individual. But then you have to use these new tools, social media, and the like, to be able to give people a different view, right, of things, right? Our young ladies are being shown a very different view of what they could be, right, and should be, and it's a lot of pressure, right, on that. So it's, what are we able to be able to show, teach in our households, and then what does our community reinforce when we leave our household? That's a much, much bigger issue. And by the way, the short answer is, I don't have the full answer to that, right? My job is to maximize the impact in my sphere of influence. So in our household, these are the things that we do. Every household has a culture. And that culture can be aligned with the community that you live in or misaligned with it, right? And then, we can use tools to help propagate that, more so and reinforce it in a powerful way. But it's difficult. The ability to affect change, even to apply this PhD model that I'm talking about, culture affects that. If I think a white lawyer is better, consciously or subconsciously, then I don't want to do business with a black lawyer. That's the problem with discrimination. It's distortionary from a commercial perspective, right? That's the problem with anti-black bias. By the way, it's not just white people that have anti-black bias.
Right.
We have anti-black bias. We deal with two levels of it. There's an external one on us, and there's an internal one that we do to ourselves, and it shows up in commerce. That's a cultural shift. That's why I wrote the book. That's why I laid all this stuff out, because I wanted to give people motivation to do more business with us and amongst us, right? So if you look at me and all you see is outsized risk, you don't want to invest in me. I get a higher interest rate. Black businesses, interest rates, 100 basis points higher, all things being equal. Black homeowners, interest rates, 100%. 100 basis points higher, all things being equal, right? It shows up in that way in terms of the economic cost. That has to be dealt with slowly, over time, but it's very difficult to deal with that and the wealth gap, right? So It's not a great answer. We need more time to kind of discuss that.
You've heard the joke. Three people are sitting in a bar. Their average income is $37,000. Bill Gates walks into the room, or Patrick Mahomes, and they're all suddenly millionaires.
Yeah.
Averaging the disparities of white people versus black people, I think he made the statement that there's 804,000.
Yep.
I don't even know that many people that have 804,000. In fact, I think 40% of white Americans couldn't fix their brakes if they broke out of cash resources. So I'm wondering how come you didn't use median income?
Because you can't do math with a median. If I have the mean times the total number, then I know what the total wealth is, right? And that's what I use the mean for, total wealth difference between the two. There's no question that there's a wealth distribution inside of white people, right?
A median would get you to what is the middle number for white people versus the middle number for black people. But in any case, I just don't think it's credible to talk about the differences between white and black people without recognizing the great disparity among all white people.
Why?
Think about.
No. My question would be, and it's a legitimate point to take, why? Right? The fact of the matter is, white people have 47 times more wealth than black people. That's a real and true thing. We cannot have the same level of accomplishments with a different level of wealth. That's very, very difficult to do. The challenge is that black people is typically the only group that's supposed to overcome their circumstance. You don't go to Harvard to overcome it. You go to Harvard to be a product of that environment, right? We are products of our environments. Our environments were not chosen by black people. They were designed for us through exclusion and deprivation. What you're seeing is what you should see based on that wealth level. If you swapped out the race and ethnicity, you're going to see no change. Hyper poverty is a driver. It's race independent, right? If you subject people to that, we don't get to say to a group that's got $14 trillion less than they otherwise should, and you have 50 times more, and then say, well, yeah, there's a wealth distribution between us. There is. And there shouldn't be a wealth distribution between you, but we didn't create that wealth distribution. And the level of poverty, you know, the median number in terms of black wealth and liquidity is $200. I have more than that in my pocket. That's for a whole black family, millions of them. You know what I mean? So my view is you don't necessarily have to agree with it, and that's okay. And it's not for you if you don't agree with it, right? The point is, do you want to understand how things came to be, and do you want to do something about it, right? And if you do, that's where the real hard work starts, right? And if you don't, that's okay too. We'd love for you to be on the other side of that equation, right? But there's nothing good, right, and just about being intransigent, right? So.
Thank you, Gwen, for letting me get my question in. This is all some really heavy stuff. I don't know about y'all, but it's heavy, right? It's heavy. It's some heavy stuff. And I'm black. There you go. I got y'all laughing a little bit, right? But I'm wondering, Shawn, if you can speak to us and give us some advice on how to break this down into bite-sized pieces, something that's palatable. Because I know black people and non-black people alike, one who may just, I don't want to hear this. I live it. I don't want to hear it. Or other people who may feel as though they're being left behind or left out, and it's heavy for them too. So I want to make sure I'm acknowledging that of other people in here as well. But I want to know from you what your ideas and your advice might be about breaking this down into bite-sized pieces for people. That way it's palatable and actionable and not just numbers. Because these numbers are, the magnitude. I think, Gwen, was you earlier who asked, what is a trillion, right at the luncheon earlier? So if you can maybe give us some advice and talk about that, Shawn, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so my goal in the book was to have it in a conversational kind of fact-based way, which you'll see when you read it. And I try to be brief. I'm brief in my writing, right? I don't think I'm so brief in my talking. And you'll see that kind of showing up in the book. But I'm also the kind of person who I have always sought to understand, right? Like, because I'm an engineer by training. Like, why is it this way? Why is it this way? Just trying to understand. And the process of understanding is being able to distill it down into its simplest form. And one of the things that Einstein said is, you should make a problem as simple as possible, but no simpler than that, right? So this is distilled from tremendous amounts of research into what I consider to be bite-sized portions already, but it's more important what you consider, right? So my thought would be it's kind of written in that way, but it's also intentional that people get it, right? Now, in terms of advice about what to do, I mean that's very broad, right? Because people kind of exist along continuums. Now, if you were like advice for young people about what to do, that's also very broad. But I'm going to focus on economics because that's kind of what I do. I think you should work really hard to make as much money as possible. And I think that you should learn as much as you possibly can to be able to manage those resources so that you're able to retain as much as possible, because we can't leave for our children what we aren't able to retain for ourselves, right? And there's what can we do as individuals under this kind of context before it gets resolved to maximize the resources, right, that we have. Education is super critical, right? I know lots of people like to say, oh, a college degree is not that big a deal. You should take that in context, because generally the people who say that don't just have college degrees, but they have masters for the finest institutions and the highest companies and the like, right? The fact of the matter is, people who have college degrees earn, I think it's 50% of all hours worked in the economy, and they get 100% premium over those who don't. It doesn't mean you can't have a trade. College degree and trade, to me, are very similar. They're based on skills. That's what they deliver to you. Develop those skills as much as possible. Save. And that's the foundation to do everything else. The home, the business, the children, the family, all of that comes from actually having resources left over from today. And we're in a society where we are rewarded for looking like we have wealth, but we don't actually have it. I would fight that with every fiber of my being, right? I think it's better to have a Civic that you own than a Mercedes that you cannot afford, right? Despite what everybody else is, however they're being rewarded, and they are being rewarded in positive ways, and I know that's tough. So from that perspective, I would say that piece. Skills development that are in demand, earn as much as possible as early as you can, save as much as you can, because savings is the foundation upon which we can build pretty much everything else.
Gwen, you think we can, one more?
One more, yeah, okay.
I do,
Last
if I can
question.
get one thing in first, I want to remind everybody there are a few books left for sale out front. And following the event, Shawn will be in the lobby signing, or if you got a pre-signed book, personalizing out by the book signing.
I want to thank you very much for addressing this topic. I've been with it for a long time. I grew up in the Deep South, Birmingham, Alabama, so I know about racial discrimination and the deliberate attempt to hold black people back and keep them out of the mainstream of American society. There's been much talk about reparations. The Asian Americans, the Japanese Americans got their due for what happened to them in World War II. And I think that ours is a long time overdue. But I have worked as a teacher in the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and I have substituted in the affluent school districts of Johnson County. So I have seen the disparity in education between the rich and the poor.
Yep.
In the Blue Valley School District, for example, the average home, only 0.7% is a single-parent home. And you look in the inner city, I see what our women, black women, go through every day to get their children a decent education. And so I thank you very much, and I thank Ms. Grant for the wonderful work she has done. But they say that there are other ways of addressing reparations other than an outright payment of money, because, you know, money just flows through some people's hands faster than with other people. So I think you've addressed it somewhat as to how we can get reparations in other ways other than money. So thank you very much, and if you have some more to say about reparations other than outright payment of money, I'd like to hear more. I'm going to get your book.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that the form that reparations should take is a really important discussion and question. You know, for me, reparations were always necessary, right? I know it's easier to talk about it kind of nowadays, right? It's just convenient. But before it wasn't fashionable, it was necessary. It's the foundation upon human behavior, right? When you do some wrong, you restore it, and you do it in terms of, you know, economic, and then you do it in terms of, you know, just relating to your fellow human. That's not something that's new. The challenge is people objected to that when it came to black people in particular, right? People always restored. It is true that, you know, if $14 trillion is roughly $1 million a family, if you kind of call it that, right? So if you have like a cash, and people should get their reparations however they get it, right? They could decide what's the best way to distribute it. There is a challenge of a massive outflow. And the challenge associated with that is because of the history that we've talked about, we don't have a well-developed black business infrastructure. 2% of black spend is with black enterprise, right? Buy 5 million cars a year, there's only 269 million black dealers in America that are black. There's 16,000 across the country. We don't have the infrastructure to be able to deploy it through a black kind of capital base, right? So these are things to be aware of. How do we create that business infrastructure, right? You know, as well. And then bias still exists. So if you buy homes in communities where people conscious or unconsciously don't want you to be, they were going to move away. It's known as white flight. And they don't just take their physical person with them, they also take all their economic resources and business and their tax base, right, with them. It becomes problematic. So these things should just be designed with these system-wide reactions built into it. So there's a countermeasure, right, to all these things. And so that's my initial thought on that. There would be an outflow. It can be designed around, right? And that's part of the important discussion that we need to have. Otherwise, what you would look at is the greatest economic stimulus that the world has ever seen. And it'll create a lot of jobs, a lot of other places. So, but.
Up, right?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Super.